Hello, everybody. My name is Daryl from Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and I want to welcome everyone to Are You Ready to Garden? Tonight it's episode 11. I want to thank our sponsors that help us put this program on. First and foremost, the New Jersey Ag Experiment Station, which is funded by the state and federal government. We're also have great partners in our county freeholders. We wouldn't be here without the support of the county government because our facilities are from the county government. And with that support from all of those entities, we're able to do research and educational programs that can actually solve many of the problems that we have in New Jersey specifically. And so with that partnership, we bring you these programs and many programs throughout the state. Tonight, we're very pleased to have two of my colleagues with us, Daryl Minch and Sandra Grenci. And Daryl is a family and community health science educator, tenured faculty member with us at Rutgers Cooperative Extension for Somerset County for 35 years. She provides leadership for the FCHS program in the Somerset County, as well as many statewide initiatives in her area of programmatic study. She was a co-leader for New Jersey's first FCHS Master Food Preserver Training Program in 2016. Daryl has preserved foods by canning and freezing since childhood and taught it to hundreds of residents over the years. Daryl's other areas of expertise are food safety, food allergies, and food and nutrition. Sandra Grenci is the family and community health science educator and a tenured faculty member for Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Hunterdon County for 13 years. She also provides leadership in that program and runs statewide initiatives for FCHS department. Sandra is an avid gardener and loves preserving her homegrown produce, so it's good that she's here with us tonight. As a registered dietitian, she focuses on helping consumers eat healthier to prevent chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. So we've got two very capable people with us today to talk to us about canning. And we're going to start off by talking about, actually, Sandra, you're going to start us off tonight. So
I will.
Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra, and we're going to get started tonight. Welcome, everyone. So without further ado, Sandra, it's all yours. Go ahead.
We're happy to share about home food preservation, and we were discussing earlier that we usually add canning in jars because a lot of people don't realize that when you can at home, it's done in glass jars only. We don't have the equipment at home to do canning in cans as they do commercially. Many years ago, there were, in some parts of the country, community canneries where you could go and take your produce and do them in cans, but nowadays we all do them at home.
I'm Sandra Grenci. Tiny review from our last presentation before we actually get into water bath canning. It's time to think about food safety at the very beginning. At the very beginning of your handling, that will encourage microorganism growth, certain types of foods, the acidity of the food, the temperature that the food is held in, the time that the food is held in an unsafe temperature danger zone, oxygen level, and moisture. So all of these things are considerations for ideal conditions for bacterial or other microorganism growth. And in selecting methods for canning and other types of home food preservation, we keep these things in mind. This is a nice depiction of the temperature danger zone for food, which is 40 degrees to 140. And I just wanted to make the point that the kind of canning that we're talking about today, the goal is to be able to store our jars at ambient temperature. So, unfortunately, that is within the danger zone for microbial growth. So we have to take a lot of precautions and follow standard methods to make sure that we are processing our foods properly so that our jars will be safe to store at room temperature, or ambient temperature, without encouraging microbial growth. Temperature is a big consideration. And always, we're experts at this now. before we handle any type of food, be it vegetables or fruit or whatever, we start with clean hands and clean working conditions. And once we have everything clean, we don't want to make the mistake of contaminating or cross-contaminating foods, raw foods like meats that can have microorganisms present on them that will be killed when you cook those foods to the proper temperatures. But we don't want to have that cutting board, for example, next to salad ingredients that will not be cooked. Those are fresh vegetables. So if we cross-contaminate microorganisms, we have the risk of contaminating our fresh salad ingredients. So use separate cutting boards, use separate utensils, be aware of cross-contamination. And last but not least, in the primer for food safety, when handling fresh garden produce or produce coming from the supermarket, some good tips to keep in mind: clean hands and surfaces, thorough washing of produce under running water before eating, cutting, or cooking. It's not recommended currently to rewash pre-washed or pre-washed and bagged salad greens, for example. Those are already pre-washed, so it's not recommended to take them out and wash them again where we can potentially contaminate them. Use clean paper towels or clean towels to dry produce. Pay attention to storage. So perishable produce such as berries and greens and herbs or cut or peeled produce should be kept in the refrigerator for long-term storage. So in summary, clean, separate, cook, and chill. Follow the 4 guidelines for safe handling of food at the very beginning of your food handling step and all the way through the steps of home food preservation. Okay, phew, we caught up. So I'm going to cover water bath canning. Daryl's going to come in later if we have left her enough time. She's making faces at me. And she's going to step in and talk about pressure canning. So a lot of what I'm covering is kind of the overview of the canning process. So lots of reasons why people are really interested in canning. I mean, you all here, almost 100 of you, have your own reasons for being interested in canning your foods. Maybe you're thinking of saving money, possibly, if you have a big garden, or after the COVID pandemic, we are more aware of sustainability. Maybe you are interested in managing personal nutrition, or you enjoy the process of preparing your own foods, or, I mean, you name it. There can be many reasons, but there is certainly a resurgence of interest in home food preservation and, in particular, including home canning. Now, I'm going to spend a minute on this slide because Dave did ask me to talk about the, actually it was Bill asked me to talk about a little bit about the nutrition content of canned foods. So, canned foods, whether they are commercially canned or we're canning them at home, they can be good substitutes for fresh produce or frozen produce, which may not always be available. In the nutrition world, I'm a dietitian, we say all forms count for fruits and vegetables. So if fresh are not available, then fresh are perishable. So if they're not always available, frozen, we talked about that 2 weeks ago, it's a great way to preserve some of your bounty. Canning, again, is another way we're going to talk about today, drying. So in particular, when we're talking about canning, so we'll be heating our foods. The question is, do we destroy any valuable nutrients by heating? So is the nutrition content of canned foods comparable to fresh or frozen? And the answer is that there's always the risk of losing some nutrients. A food that is fresh picked right off of the vine or the plant is at its maximum nutrition content. But those vitamins and minerals can degrade over time as we handle and store or transport those foods. So, off-season foods versus foods in season. Heating, in particular, so we'll be talking about heating our home preserved foods. Heating can destroy certain water-soluble vitamins, like vitamin C, some B vitamins. It may not destroy all of them. That's really dependent on how long we're heating, at what temperature, is air present, is water present, what was the content before we started. So there's a lot of variables. You can't say that there was no nutrition left there's no vitamin C, that's not the case. But in general, there's the possibility that water-soluble vitamins can be reduced by heating. But on the other hand, there are some vitamins and substances in fruits and vegetables that are enhanced by heating. And so the big one that has probably got the most publicity is lycopene in tomatoes and other yellow and orange vegetables. So the research on that suggests that heating makes that more available, more bioavailable. Fiber, in some cases, can be easier to digest in cooked vegetables. But the take-home message is it's important to eat the required amount of servings of fruits and vegetables every day to be healthy. All forms count. If freezing, dehydrating, canning, and fresh help you reach your nutrition goals, then that is great, because missing 1, 2, 3, or 4 servings of fruits and vegetables a day has a much greater impact than a slight loss of one vitamin or mineral here or there. So all forms count. We just need to eat them. Okay, so what is the basic, in case you're a beginner canner, the basic idea of safe home canning is we're going to start with a high-quality produce or food. We're going to prepare it according to specific and tested methods. Daryl and you will hear that a lot in tonight's presentation. We're going to be preparing the food, placing it into glass jars. As Daryl mentioned, we're talking about canning in jars with a 2-piece lid, and I have pictures of these pieces of equipment throughout the PowerPoint. And our goal is to heat those jars to a temperature and a time that will destroy harmful microorganisms. And the temperature range that we're shooting for is between 212 and 240 degrees Fahrenheit. Heating will also inactivate enzymes that are those proteins that occur naturally in fruits and vegetables that can cause changes in color and texture and flavor. So it suppresses those. And in the water bath or pressure canning process, we're going to be driving air from the jars during the heating process, and that's going to remove air and form a vacuum seal if we are successful. So that's our big goal. That's our picture, big picture.
And we should say that this is, while a lot of this sounds complicated, if you've never done it, it's really not that hard. So it can be fun. Just follow the steps.
Yes, later on I have sort of a step-by-step couple of slides that go through the process and some pictures. It is fun, right? So it really is. It's good. If you're scared, pair up with somebody and do it together. That's a good way to start. We can talk later on, about some easy things to start with, but you've got to kind of have the big picture of what we're doing for time management and logistics, and just so you know what our goals are in water bath canning. So remember that vacuum seal. We're going to be driving air out of our jars. In the United States, we use a 2-piece lid system, and in other parts of the world there may be different lids that are commonly used, but in the United States, this 2-piece lid system is recommended. And by generating a good vacuum seal, we're preventing contamination from the outside, so air contaminating the product from the outside. And if we have been successful with that vacuum seal, we've also removed a lot of air, which will prevent drying out of the surface of our product. Air desiccates, air dries. So we want to remove as much of it as possible. How do we know? This is a big question. How do we know what method to choose? You do not need to memorize anything. There are guidelines that we use to select the right canning method. And it starts with the type of food that we'll be canning. First, we'll divide foods into two main types based on their acid level. Acidic foods, acid foods we call them, or low acid foods. So remember your pH scale in general chemistry. Neutral was 7, acid was down towards 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. Basic was on the other end. We're going to divide foods into those two categories, acid and low acid. And we don't have to use pH paper. This has all been determined for us. So acid foods, in general, have a pH less than 4.6, so that's pretty low, right? And there are general groups of foods that fall into this category. Generally, all fruits fall here. Tomatoes, figs, and Asian pears are borderline. So we have to do a little extra special step to make them acidic enough to be able to use water bath canning for this particular class of foods. And what we actually do is we add bottled lemon juice or citric acid to every jar before canning these foods. And you don't have to memorize this because when we're looking at specific methods, it will tell you we need to do this for this food. Sauerkraut, or a fermented food. So we're naturally creating, through the process of fermentation, acids, organic acids. So the pH of a fermented food will be low enough to be water bath canned. And then another obvious group where we're adding acid in the form of vinegar, so pickles. We are driving that pH down by adding pretty large amounts of vinegar to make pickles. So we're taking a food that ordinarily would not be able to be water bath canned, and we are making it suitable for water bath canning. The other side of the coin are the low acid foods. So this would be foods that have a pH greater than 4.6 in the canning world. This is where all other vegetables fall. And besides vegetables, meats, poultry, seafood, soups, which are mixtures of vegetables, any other kind of mixture, so tomato sauce that have meat and vegetables besides tomatoes. So all of those foods are lumped into the low acid category, and they must be pressure canned. So Daryl is going to talk about those after I'm done with water bath canning. A little more, since tomato season is upon us, a little more about the acidity of tomatoes. You really can't guess. You can't say, oh, I have a high acidity tomato or a low acidity tomato. The consumer can't make that determination. They vary by growing conditions, by how mature they are, probably weather. I mean, you name it. Your canning method will tell you what type of tomato to select. So slightly underripe, firm, not overripe. This information, guidance will come in the method. We'll talk about some of the methods later. But your methods are not only concerned about safety, but they're concerned about generating the best quality product too when you're done. So all of this has been taken into consideration when we're talking about a tested method. And I did mention already that we add acid in the form of bottled lemon juice or citric acid to all tomato products. That's part of the standard method. This gives you a kind of a guideline of about how much: a tablespoon of bottled lemon juice or a quarter teaspoon of citric acid for a pint, double that for a quart. We don't want to use fresh lemon juice because we don't know the acidity of fresh lemon juice. We know that bottled lemon juice has to meet a certain acidity level, a pH level. So that's why, and again, we're trying to remove all the variables that could make our product potentially unsafe.
Sandy, what should the pH be, just out of curiosity?
Well, we don't measure pH. That's the thing. There is no recommendation for consumers who are doing home food preservation to use pH paper or pH meter. We go by the years and volumes of research that has determined which categories of foods should be processed by which method. There is no place to be measuring pH in the home kitchen. You have to follow.
If you wanted to create something yourself, you'd have to go to a food lab, a food technology center, such as the one at Rutgers, and engage their services to do all that testing where they look at pH and heat penetration and all of that. And we want to make it easy for consumers. So we're going to share with you the sources for good, safe directions, recipes, if you will, so that we don't have to do that piece of it.
Thanks.
Okay, so again, 2 approved methods of canning foods at home: boiling water bath. I think that's one of the cats making noise over there. Boiling water bath canning for acid foods. This is what I'm talking about in my part. We can reach a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level through boiling water. However, the pressure canning method can reach a higher temperature. It can reach at least 240 degrees Fahrenheit, and that is necessary for low acid foods and those mixtures of acid and low acid foods. And there's a very specific reason why we need to go to that extra mile. It's because of the potential for heat-resistant spores of Clostridium botulinum. They cannot be killed at 212 degrees. They need to be killed at 240 degrees. So the spores can be very resistant, and they love to grow in low oxygen. They're anaerobic, so they grow in low oxygen conditions, and that's what we're trying to make in a properly sealed canning jar. So we're setting them up. If we're not doing pressure canning, we're setting them up to have a very enjoyable environment to proliferate. That's basically the problem with Clostridium botulinum spores. So pressure canning will kill those spores because we can reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit. We don't even want to talk about symptoms or what happens when you have Clostridium botulinum. The bottom line is that there are still cases of this occurring in people in recent years, mostly linked to home canned vegetables. In fact, this last bullet I have in 2015, one person died and 29 people became ill due to home canned potatoes, and I believe they were made into a potato salad that was served at a church potluck. So they were improperly processed. It does still happen today. It's not that common, thankfully, but you do need to know why we select pressure canning for certain types of foods.
And one other thing is that the botulinum doesn't grow in acidic environments. It doesn't like that. So when we're canning pears and peaches and jams or pickles, that's not a concern because it won't grow in that environment. But if you are canning carrots and corn, a low acid food, that is a concern. So that's important to why we choose one method over the other as well.
Exactly. So remember that list, that Fat Tom acronyms. The acid level matters, the temperature matters, the amount of air matters, the fact that the jar will be stored in the temperature danger zone. So all of those factors are important to determine which of the 2 main types of canning methods we're going to be using. So some more important musts for canning. There are tested standard methods from USDA, and there are some manufacturers that have extremely reliable methods, such as Ball, that's been around for more than 100 years. Recipes have to be properly prepared. We need to follow a tested and a safe method. Daryl's going to talk about making sure the pressure canner is accurate. How do you know if the gauge is operating properly? You know, I took a minute to, generally we say in New Jersey we don't have to worry about altitude adjustments for...
That's not true. We do.
You know what? I looked it up. There are actually 6 counties in New Jersey that have elevations greater than 1,000 feet. Now, that doesn't mean that could be like state park areas and things like that. But the bottom line is we have to start making an altitude adjustment for time above 1,000 feet. That's because any oil.
Yeah, I know Sussex County has a few.
I'm going to tell you right now, I did my research. Bergen, I would never have guessed Bergen. Hunterdon, I knew possibly there were some sections. Morris, Passaic, Sussex, and Warren. So there you go.
And if you are living in any of those high altitude states like Vermont or Colorado, it's really important. So
that is a given.
Your GPS on your phone to figure out altitude of things, or check with your planning department, but then all of the directions tell you how to adjust for altitude.
Yeah, I actually think I have
within the 1,000 feet.
Sorry, I think I have a little chart later on coming up. But the bottom line is why we have to do that is water boils at a lower temperature as altitude increases. So we have to extend the processing time. That's the chemistry or physics behind that. Okay, beware. Cannot tell you how many times we have to tell consumers this when they call with questions. Beware outdated methods that may not incorporate the latest science. This is food science. Watch out for blogs that are moderated by people that may not have the knowledge and experience to refer you to standard tested methods. So there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. One of the most important things you can learn tonight is where to find tested methods. And 2 of the ones, like I keep saying, USDA, cooperative extension sites across the country, like us, are trained to deliver evidence-based programming in food preservation. The National Center for Home Food Preservation, we have Daryl. I think we're going to direct people to our website for all the resources at the end. Correct? Yeah. Okay, and Ball. Okay. What does it all mean? You have to follow directions, avoid modifying things, changing ingredients, adding extras of things, adding thickeners because that changes the density within the jar. Daryl's going to tell you what pressure canning, the cool down process of the pressure canner is part of the standard method, processing time. So don't willy-nilly modify the important characteristics of a recipe.
And if you want to change things up later on, what I'm telling you is you have a tomato sauce recipe and you go, oh, I normally add X, Y, Z. You know what? Can it according to the tested recipe, and then when you open that jar of sauce, you can do whatever you want at the other end. There's no creativity in canning unless you hire a company to develop the recipe for you. So do the creativity at the other end and follow the well-tested recipes at the beginning.
And there are plenty. Ball has come up with very creative, tested recipes. In the past couple of years, they've published some really nice cookbook-type resources. The University of Georgia has a very nice consumer-friendly cookbook-type guidance book. So there are lots of recipes to start with. It's important to understand the food science about why some things shouldn't be changed, and why some things are safe to modify. So understanding the science is the most important part. Then you won't have to be kind of beholden to other people to tell you what to do, who actually may not have the proper information. So just to give you an idea of, like, you know, starting at square one, here's the process for a canning session in your kitchen. So you're going to select what you want to can, and you're going to select a method and a recipe from a reputable, tested source. Then you're going to gather up all the equipment. I'm going to show you some of the equipment that you need. And this does take some time. So, you know, this is not something that you want to do, you know, to budget half an hour in between errands. This is going to take several hours, maybe longer. So this is a big block of time to gather and execute the canning session. You have to have everything ready so that it flows smoothly. Then you're going to do whatever preparation steps the recipe calls for the product that you are working with, be it you know, cutting it, slicing it, chopping it to a certain size, cooking it, whatever. Once that part's done, you will fill your jars. I'll have some pictures of that. You're going to be putting those filled jars into the canner for the required amount of time that is specified in every method. There's no guesswork. Then you will remove the jars. You will put them in a safe place where they can sit for 12 to 24 hours while the seals are sealing. You're not going to be moving them around. You're not going to be touching them. So they need to sit quietly. And then when you will check your seals, I have pictures coming up, and then eventually you're going to remove the metal ring band and you will label them and store them. So that's kind of the process from step one through the end. I know, of course, eating is the very last step. Okay, so I wanted to mention a couple things about the preparation part of the product. When you look through the standard methods, you'll see that different types of foods have different types of packs or processing, pre-processing suggested. So a raw pack where we don't cook the food in advance, and a hot pack, which is some sort of cooking of the food before it goes into the jar. So I just wanted to go over the pros and cons of the different types of pack, and your tested methods will recommend. They will tell you, raw pack, do this, hot pack, do this. If there is not a recommended hot pack for a recipe, that means either there was some problem with them generating a tested method and they're not recommending it. So the methods will specify, and they're considering the safety as well as the quality of the final product. So the raw pack, pickles is a good example of something that would be raw packed. Now I have a jar. I don't know how well you can see stuff that I hold up, but I have some jalapeno pickles that I made.
Yes, I had some.
Yeah, well, thank you, Daryl. She's my best customer. So I didn't cook those peppers. They go in cleaned, and they're raw when they go into the jar. And then a hot liquid, a hot vinegar solution, vinegar and water or spices, is poured over the raw peppers when they go into the jar. And so a food that we want to try to keep as crisp or as close to a raw texture. We don't want a cooked texture. Kind of tough. That looks really easy, but it can be difficult to pack raw packed foods tightly in the jar, and we want to pack them tightly. So number one, we want to get all the air bubbles out before we put those lids on. Because they have a lot of texture and presence. Versus a hot pack. So a hot pack, again, is generally the preferred method for most foods. We're going to be cooking the food down for some amount of time before we put it into the jar. And that makes it so much easier to fill a jar and to remove air bubbles, and we can get a lot of food into the jar and not end up with loss of headspace when we're done because of air. So it makes it really is easy to handle a hot pack, but it's an extra step. It does take some time. There's less floating of the product, less trapped air. And again, the method will tell you which is preferred. Many foods can be done either way, but you want to follow the recommendations of a tested method. So I mentioned that word headspace. So headspace is the distance from the top of that jar to the top of the product, whatever level it will be. And this picture shows you 1/4-inch headspace, a 1/2-inch headspace, and 1-inch headspace. And different types of foods will require a different headspace. So I think on my next slide, yeah. So you'll see for jellies, I have, let's see what I have here. Well, this is a rum sauce that a peach rum sauce. I think those were Snyder peaches too. That was a 1/4-inch headspace. Most jams and jellies are 1/4-inch. Other kinds of fruit, which I do not have here. I do have some tomatoes. Wait a minute. Let's see. That's hard to see. Tomatoes, pickles. Well, my pickles did have a 1/2-inch headspace. And in pressure canning, the low-acid foods will have a headspace that's a little bit larger, or 1 inch to 1 1/4 inches. So you don't need to memorize these numbers. But believe me, you'll see them over and over in the methods and recipes. What happens if you have too little headspace? So you fill your jar too high to the top? Well, when you go to put your lid on and you put that into the water bath, you can just lose product into your water bath. And that's going to not only make a mess in your water bath, but then you're not going to have a sealed jar. Your rim is going to fail. If you have too much headspace, so you leave too much air in the jar, then you might notice that the top of the food will discolor from that trapped air. And you may also have problems with your jar sealing because you haven't formed a strong enough vacuum. So headspace matters, and it's a little bit of a practice to get good at, hitting 1/4-inch or 1/2-inch. But, in our master food preserver classes, we sometimes use a little ruler, or put a little mark on the jar, and it gets better with practice. So here's some of the canning tools that you will need to buy for water bath canning. On the left is the big classic canning pot. I want to mention the difference between that pot and the pot that's down on the bottom that has that flat bottom on the right. It matters whether you have a gas stove or a flat electric stove, a smooth, flat surface stove. For an electric stove like I have to use a canning pot that looks exactly like that one on the lower right, because I need the surface of that pot to sit flat on my burner. If I picked up the bottom of the big enamel pot and looked at it, you would see ridges on the bottom. That's ideal for sitting on top of a gas burner. So if you have a gas stove, you're home free with the standard type of canning pot. If you have a smooth-topped electric stove, check with your stove manufacturer to make sure your burner capacity is even indicated for canning. And if so, you definitely need a flat bottom pot like this one on the bottom right. So moving moving clockwise from the big canning pot, that little wand-looking thing, that's a lid grabber. We don't really use those so much anymore because the manufacturer's lids, they used to have to be kept warm in boiling water or simmering water, and then they'd be hot, so you have to lift them with something. But now manufacturers, the kinds of lids we use in the United States, the manufacturers don't require keeping them warm. You can use them you can just wash them, dry them, and use them at room temperature. So this thing, you know, if you have trouble picking them up, it's still okay. They're magnetic, but it's not as useful as it was when the lids were really hot to touch. Smack in the middle there is a rack. Every canner needs some kind of a rack. You don't want to put the jars flat on the bottom of the canning pot because they can bounce around and crack. A jar lifter is very useful. I have another slide of that. That's that tongy looking thing, grabber there. A funnel, absolute necessity. And then you'll need whatever size jars and lids are required for your recipe. And here's more on those lids. So the actual lid, the lid terminology is the lid is the flat, this picture on the bottom right, the flat, skinny piece that has a sealing compound on the bottom. So those are the lids. The metal thing that goes around the lid, you can call that the ring band, the metal band, that just keeps the lid on the jar. So when I said we use a two-piece lid system in the United States, this is what we mean. This flat lid piece and the ring band that secures it to the jar. So right now, basically, you can wash this is the part of that preparation that I mentioned, that you have to be ready before you even start talking about chopping vegetables. You have to make sure that your lids are washed and dried, that your ring bands are washed and dried, that your jars are washed. They can be washed and kept in the dishwasher. You're going to put them into your canning pot to keep them warm while you're processing your product. They just need to be clean. And we usually say follow manufacturer's guidelines for prepping or cleaning, preparing your lids. There's the funnel, very important funnel. You'll need, besides a funnel, I don't have a picture of this, but you're going to need some kind of a plastic or wood or not a metal tool to remove bubbles once you fill your jar. And you just run that around the rim and inside the jar. Once it's filled, you'll see some bubbles, trapped bubbles, come up to the surface. If we didn't try to remove some of those bubbles, then they would affect our headspace in the end. We use plastic because we don't want to nick the jar. If you notice after doing that your headspace dropped a little bit and now it's not where it should be, you're going to carefully add more product. Sometimes I add it with a smaller spoon than that because I would go right over the top. Very important step. After you're done, you're at the right headspace, you're going to wipe around the actual rim. I don't have an empty jar, but if this were empty, the top where the lid is going to seal. Make sure there's no product left on that part because it potentially won't seal. And you just use a clean, damp paper towel. Then you place your lid on. Then you place your ring band on and adjust to fingertip tight. So Daryl, fingertip tight. How would you define that?
So when you screw on the ring band, you want to just, once you feel resistance, you stop. Don't use the strong arm to tighten it down because we want air to be driven out of the jar, and if it's too tight, that can't happen. So just till you get to resistance and you're done.
Fingertip tight. It's an art, not a science.
This is not one where you want to tighten it down really tight to screw two boards together.
Exactly. Yes. And the important point is that we do want to, we want that trapped air, we want that air to come out. Okay. So we're getting close to the end. I know Daryl says speed it up. Okay. So just to refresh, boiling water processing steps one more time. You're going to have water simmering, at least 6 inches of water in your canner, simmering or hot.
Let me interrupt. The water depth has to be enough to cover the jars.
I have that.
What she's going to say. So for 6 inches would only do the really small jars, and if you had quart jars, you're going to need a pot.
You'll notice, though, that when you put your filled jars in, your volume is going to go up.
Yes.
So don't overfill the canner immediately before you put your jars in, because you'll have to take some of that water out. So start with at least 6 inches, but the goal, once we put those jars in on that rack, we need at least an inch, so between an inch, inch and a half of water flowing over the top of the jars. And we also want water to flow around the jars. We want equal contact of all surfaces of the jar with boiling water flowing. So if your water level isn't right, you have to have hot water to add to that canner before you start your processing. And you don't want to pour it directly on top of your jars, because you could displace those lids. Just pour it around the jars. So you remember, you need to be thinking about, I need hot water in case it gets easier. After a while, you know what it's like to process small jars, large jars, and you're ready. A few more tips. You need to be at a full rolling boil, and that's when you start your timing. How do you know how much time? You refer to your method. If you need to make an altitude adjustment for time, you do it, if you're in one of those 6 counties in New Jersey in a certain spot. After processing, turn off the canner, remove the lid away from your face so you don't get, it's very hot. It's very hot working over boiling water. And you wait 5 minutes before removing the jars. That is part of the timing calculated in the method. Lift the jars straight up out of the canner. Place them on a towel, a clean towel, or a padded surface, not on your granite countertop where they could crack it, and leave them undisturbed to cool. You'll check your seals. I have a picture of that really fast. Remove the ring bands. Label jars with the date and product. So this is a chart for altitude adjustment. Just know, you can see, let's look at the, for the hot pack for pints, 20 minutes up to 1,000 feet, but then we're adding 5 minutes for every couple of 1,000 feet that we go up. And it varies by the size of the jar too. So altitude process is longer. That's the take-home message. There's a good picture of straight up and down filling the canner, nice and straight up and down so we don't spill anything or jar the lid. Nicely spaced jars in the canner. Water can flow all around. The next day, after 12 to 24 hours, how do you know that the jar is sealed? Well, you should not have that bump on the lid. It's, what's concave? What's the word? Concave or convex? But it's down. It will not move the center of the lid. You won't be able to move the lid. Sometimes you'll hear them popping, the popping noise of the sealing when you take them out of the canner, but you don't always hear that. And where to store them? Move the metal ring band, Daryl will say, because if you don't have a good seal and you have some kind of degradation in the jar, a jar can explode. If you have gas production, it'll be a lot easier. What do we want to say? So
if the lid pops up versus the glass breaking.
Yes, that's it.
But you don't need so many ring bands.
Right, you don't need to keep buying zillions of them. So they rust when you leave them in certain places and when you leave them on jars. So it's good to store them in a very dry place. Store in a cool, dry place. Use within 1 year. Some of the ball new lids say up to 18 months. And enjoy your bounty. Okay, Daryl?
A quick question. How about reusing the lids and the canning jar and the lids themselves?
Okay.
Some people had questions about that.
Yeah, so the lids are one-time use. Ring bands can be reused as long as they don't get dented, rusty. You'll see after a while they develop, spots of rust. Jars can be reused, canning jars, not mayonnaise jars. That's a good point. It's not recommended to use non-canning jars. Canning jars should be designated, developed for canning because they have to withstand high heat for a long period of time. We don't want them to shatter. You can reuse them, but just make sure that they don't have any nicks and chips and things like that on them. So if you find them at a yard sale, that's great, but check them carefully.
And someone was asking if it was necessary to use a rack in the flat bottom pot. You have to have the rack.
All canners need racks, and you might have a pasta pot that would work for this, and you can buy racks separately, and I've seen even silicone little rack components. So there are options, but you don't want the jars sitting on the bottom of your canner because they can crack that way. You want the you want the water to circulate under the jars, so you do need that piece.
I've seen this on YouTube and a few other places where people turn the jars upside down to cool them off. Is that something you've seen or know about?
No, don't do that.
Okay, there you go.
Doesn't work.
That's probably an outdated method left over from, I'm not sure what decade, but there is absolutely no evidence that
You don't want to do any canning in ovens, in the microwave. Everything has to either be pressure canned or water canned.
And for both of you too, the question is for headspace. You talked about leaving that headspace. So for measuring that, you were saying just put a mark on the jar itself before you get started, so you know what that quarter or half-inch spacing should be.
I've done that, like with beginning. I would take the sample and just mark where that quarter-inch or half-inch is. Or
the thread to the jar, you can use those. So as you look at the jar, the threads come down, and they spin kind of, and that's the way so the top one is about a quarter, the middle is about half, and the wider rim is about an inch.
Yeah. So you can, like again, after a while, you know to eyeball the different headspace levels. That comes with practice. It
doesn't have to be perfect, but it can't be a huge difference.
Exactly.
And then one final question about the metal rings and taking them off. I did see someone ask earlier if you have to take them off and why you removed the metal rings after they're sealed.
Okay, so we take them off because, number one, we don't need them. As long as the jars are sealed, the metal ring band has done its job. So we don't need to have them on there. They can rust if there's moisture in any area where you're storing them. And if there's a very low chance that you have a jar that will have some issue with gas production, molding, and that jar with a tight ring band on it, the gas can't escape. So that jar might explode as opposed to just pop of a lid. So they don't need to be on as long as you have done your job. The ring band and the lid have done the job of producing a good, tight vacuum seal.
Also, real quickly, one last thing from Anita here. She's asking, can you stack bottles on top of each other for storage? And how high can you go, I guess, with those?
Well, you know, it was interesting. I saw some pictures of jars being stacked. I generally don't stack. I would prefer to have nothing on the lid. I don't know if that's just, I mean, technically, if you have a good seal, there's no way, you know, you can't move this lid. But I think just out of an abundance of caution, I don't like to place things on top of my lid.
I agree, and I wouldn't, if I was stacking, I would only go, you know, one on top of the other. Because remember, these are glass. I don't know about anyone else, but I'm a little clumsy. My cabinets are too full. And if I knock a can out, it doesn't break or dislodge, but if I knock a glass jar off the shelf, the seal may break, the glass may break, so I would not, I would try really hard not to stack more than too high or come up with some other system.
Thank you very much. Okay, Daryl, you're on.
Okay, so again, low acid foods, and this would be your carrots, your corn, your beets, not pickled beets, but regular plain beets, green beans, meat or poultry products are low acid foods, and they need to go into the pressure canner. And Sandra talked about this before, but even I was interested, even as recent as 2018, 3 people were hospitalized with botulism after eating improperly canned peas. So the person had leftover peas and said, oh, I have so many peas, I'm going to can them. I canned peaches, and that's what she did. She followed the water bath method for peaches and used the peas, not realizing that wasn't safe. And in fact, they opened those peas, put them in another potato salad, and 3 family members got sick. And while they recovered, they were in the hospital for a long time, and it can be fatal. So all low acid foods, pressure canner. And again, you have to think about what you want and what kinds of foods you like to do. I personally don't own a pressure canner. I don't like any canned vegetable. It doesn't matter if it was done by the home canner or a commercial canner. I just don't like it. I'd rather have frozen green beans than canned green beans. So I don't do the foods that would require a pressure canner. But if you do, and you would like to do more of that, then you're going to need to choose. There are 2 types of pressure canners, a dial gauge, and you can see pictures here of dials. You know, they have the needle that moves, and a weighted gauge. And I have a picture somewhere with the weighted gauge. I'll talk first about the dial gauge. That dial shows you with the hand there what the pressure is inside the canner. Dial have to be checked for accuracy. Manufacturers suggest that you check them annually. Certainly if you inherited a canner from someplace else, you'd want to check it. If you drop the gauge or the canner, you'd want to check it, because if that gauge is not accurate, then you don't have the right pressure inside and your food may not be safe. It does allow you a little more flexibility for altitude adjustment. There is another weight or counterweight that closes a vent on the canner to pressurize, but that's not how you indicate pressure. How you change the pressure is by increasing or decreasing the burner heat. Both dial and weighted gauge, you can get those online. You may be able to find them in some stores. I think I don't see them in the stores much. Water bath canners are pretty widely available in supermarkets and box stores, but pressure canners, you probably have to order that online. They're at least $100. Weighted gauge canners have a weight, and that weight sits over a little opening, kind of a pipe, and by adjusting which weight you use, that tells you what the pressure is. You can't test those for accuracy, but the beauty is they've been commercially designed so you don't ever have to test them. So the canner pressure canner I have that came with my job a long time ago in the office is a weighted gauge. It's always accurate. I don't have to worry about it. So I kind of like that. Weighted gauges can be either a one-piece, and there is a picture somewhere along here I'll show you, but you just flip it to the right spot that says 5, 10, or 15 pounds of pressure. Those are your 3 choices. And when you pressure can, the directions, recipe, method will tell you what pressure to use for that particular product. It jiggles 3 or 4 times a minute. You'll see it jiggle, you'll hear it jiggle. There are also some manufacturers that did a 3-piece system where you took the pieces apart or put them together to get you those 5, 10, or 15 pounds. and they kind of rock, and how quickly they rock. Just want a steady rocking motion to make sure it's working properly. People always ask, can I use my pressure cooker to can? The answer is no. The USDA processes say that the canner has to be big enough to hold 4 quart-sized jars. One reason for that is that those smaller pressure canners that you might use to prepare your dinner have a smaller volume, so that affects the temperature and its ability to hold the temperature, so they are not recommended. You don't get enough heat during that pressurizing and cool down process, which is part of the science behind how they determine the time. So you need to invest in a true pressure canner. Most importantly is to read the user manual. If you inherit one and the manual is gone, go to the web and see if you can get the directions. Probably you can. You want to read it so you're familiar with the parts. You want to know how to follow the steps. If it's brand new, you need to wash all the parts like you would for any other new product. There's sometimes some manufacturing oils you want to remove. It'll tell you how to maintain it. Sometimes they lubricate things. Some parts, like the gasket, which is a piece of rubber that seals helps maintain the seal, is replaceable. So if yours is dried out, you can probably, if the manufacturer is still in business, get a new one. One important part is to look at the pipes that you'll see. They're little pipes, metal pipes at the top lid of the canner. You want to make sure they're clear and open, no food in there. All modern canners have safety plugs in them, so it's usually gray or white in the lid of the canner, and they're designed to pop should the pressure get too high in the canner. Everyone's heard horror stories about pressure cookers or pressure canners exploding way back in the 30s. Those little safety features have been built in so that that can't happen. If the pressure gets too high, that plug will pop and the steam will come out and the pressure canner remains safe. So it's not unsafe. First step will be that you need to get all the air out of that canner so we can increase the amount of steam in the canner, and that steam is what we are able to get the 240 degrees inside the canner. So when you first start, you're going to turn up the heat and allow the steam to escape through the pipe before you close that process. All pressure canners do need to be vented or exhausted so that we make sure that we're at the proper pressure. If you didn't do this step, you may not have the sterilizing volume, and you would be putting the product in an unsafe condition. So steam comes through that vent port for about 10 minutes. So let me just back up. So you're going to put the amount of water in the bottom of the canner. There is a flat rack. So again, the jars are not sitting on the bottom of the canner. You put the jars in, and there's usually a couple of inches of water. You don't need to fill the pot. It's only a couple inches of water. You put your jars in the canner. You close the canner as per the directions. Sometimes it's a twist. Sometimes there are screws to screw on the top. Again, you're going to practice that when the canner is cold to make sure you know what you're doing. So the jars go in, you fasten the lid, you leave the vent port open, and then you turn the heat up to high, and as the water inside the canner boils, the steam is going to rise out of that pipe or vent. And you're going to wait for that steam for at least 10 minutes. And at the end of the 10 minutes, you'll be putting a weight on top of that to pressurize the canner. It would be either the weight in the weighted gauge itself, or in a dial gauge canner, there'll be a separate weight, and you'll be looking at the dial. So here you see on the top left, you're putting your jars in the canner. Then you'll, in the top right, you'll kind of see there's a little steam coming out. And then the person is putting on a weighted gauge. That's a weighted gauge right there in the middle. And then it starts rocking. So once the weight is on, you're going to keep the heat on until you get that rocking or jiggling on a weighted gauge, or until the dial gets to where it's supposed to be. It might be 11 pounds of pressure. And when you see it get to 11 pounds of pressure, that's when you start the clock, or when the weight starts to jiggle. That's when you start the clock. In pressure canning, processing time, how much time you're keeping it at that pressure, can be long. Someone asked, could you do fish? Yes, you can can fish. Fish, for a fatty fish, a pint jar takes 1 hour and 40 minutes in the pressure canner. So it's a long time. And you may not leave the kitchen during this time because you're going to have to monitor the heat to make sure the dial stays where it is on a dial gauge canner, or that the weight continues to rock. If you walk away or the heat drops and it stops, you have to start all over at time 0. So important to bring a book, hang out, but stay focused on the task at hand. You do have a little bit more headspace because the product's in the canner longer. The simmering water is in there for starting out. You can have the water simmering for hot pack jars, a little cooler for the raw pack jars. I already explained this. Exhaust the canner. You do need to adjust for altitude just as you do in the boiling water bath. Once the time is done and you've processed, let's say it was 70 minutes, you're going to turn off the heat and you have to let the canner's pressure drop to 0 naturally. And that can take a long time if it's a fully loaded canner. Most water baths and pressure canners hold 7 quart jars and a few more pint jars perhaps. You're going to wait till the pressure is gone, and then you will carefully open the lid. There will still be steam in there, so make sure you're tipping that lid away from you and not letting the steam come up into your face. You'll remove the jars just as you did in the boiling water bath to a padded surface with toweling, keeping some space between the jars, and then you're going to let them cool that 12 to 24 hours so that it's done. The dial gauge will tell you'll know it's the pressure has dropped because the needle will come down to 0. On a weighted gauge, sometimes there are locks that you'll be able to see if open, or the canner has to be very cool, almost cold to the touch. And as it says here, it can take 45 minutes for a heavy wall canner through full of quart jars. So it takes a while. You're going to let the jars cool. You'll test the seals by pressing on the lid. You won't get any flecks. You want to remove your ring bands just as you did before. Clean your jars. Label and date your content, and store in the cool, dry, dark place. If you lose pressure, as I said, you'd have to start all over because the product would be under-processed, and that's not good. So you'd have to bring the canner back up to pressure and start the timing all over, and then your food's overcooked, so you don't want that either.
We have a question. Can you do jars of different sizes in one canner?
You cannot do different size jars in one pressure canner unless the processing time was exactly the same. You could in a water bath because you're able to remove the jars at the right time, although, I don't know, my brain, that's too complicated for me. So more than likely you're going to do everything of the same size, but in a pressure canner you can't open it up and take out jar A and then repressurize and finish with jar B. So yes, in a boiling water bath it's possible, but I think it's a little hard to keep track of. Would you agree? You want to keep the heat pretty stable. You don't want the pressure going up and going down too much because that's how liquid gets lost from the jars or it could crack the jars. You don't ever want to force cool a canner, which in pressure cooking, sometimes you cool your pressure cooker really quickly because you want to stop the process. But force cooling a canner results in spoilage. That cool down time is counted when they develop the recipes. That is part of the processing time, so you can't do that. Dial gauges. So I told you they recommend having them tested regularly. So the ways you can do that are either having a special equipment, a thermometer, or using a master dial gauge. If you're only off by a pound or two, you can adjust all your recipes. You'll have to know that and adjust. If it's off by more, they generally recommend replacing the gauge. Where do you get those tested? That's a good question. I have a tester in my office. I think Gloucester County has one. If I get one request a year to test them, and right now, unfortunately, we're not open to the public right now, so I don't know where people are testing or they're not. But again, if you're getting something that's not a new piece of equipment, find a place to get it tested. Some manufacturers will allow you to mail it back to them, and they will, either for a fee or no fee, will test the accuracy of the gauge. So that's another possibility. We shared with you some of the common sites, but if you were to go to the njaes.rutgers.edu website and go to the food and nutrition page, and then you can go down and get to food safety, or just go njaes.rutgers.edu and look for food safety. There is one page on home food preservation, and we have listed some reliable resources. It's not all inclusive, but it gives you the links to lots of those. It'll have some basic information. It's not a source for recipes or videos because the National Center for Home Food Preservation, and there are other groups that have done that, so we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So that's all we had. If there are questions, you want to type them into the Q&A box, and I'll hand it back to Dave and Bill. We'll answer questions.
Thank you very much. You guys did a great job. I think we've covered most of the questions. Brenda, did you see any other questions in there that we haven't covered?
No need to rewash greens. Why? So if you buy pre-washed greens, the food safety experts do not want you to rewash those because that's an opportunity to reintroduce bacteria or other pathogens into the food, and the manufacturer is guaranteeing that they have done a good job of washing. So if you're buying bagged salad that says pre-wash, no need to wash, or bagged greens like spinach that say that, you do not need to wash them again.
You guys, just for preparation for the area before you even get started, what would you recommend, in terms of cleaning the area where you're going to get started and just kind of prepping that so that we don't introduce any bacteria or other contaminants into that?
Just a good soap and water, and rinse off the soap. If you use a commercial cleaning spray of some kind, you want to read the directions and follow those. Sometimes you need to rinse, sometimes you don't, but just a good wipe down your counters as you would for any food preparation.
Thank you very much. You guys are great. But I want to thank our two speakers today, my colleagues Daryl Minch and Sandra Grenci. You guys did a terrific job. We were very fortunate to have you on two of our programs. And,
we're happy to do it.
And as I said, a couple of us have already ordered those food dryers. I'm looking forward to actually drying down some of these fruits and vegetables just to see what they taste like. So.
And I wanted to say that in our non-COVID lives or pre-COVID lives, some of us offer hands-on classes, and Daryl is the queen of hands-on classes. She's got an awesome kitchen. But hopefully we'll get back to the point where we can offer hands-on, because there's just no way to learn canning from a PowerPoint. It's the hands-on experience that really is essential.
And I will say that you could probably find online, even for some of the sites that are on our list, videos, and that's helpful. And I love Sandra's suggestion of find a friend. Water bath is an easy place to start. Jams and jellies, easy, no risk there. Pickling products, fruit, pressure canning. There's a few more steps, but pick the foods that you like. Bring a friend. Get started.
So that's exactly what I was going to ask you. What would be so walking into this as a beginner, they would be better starting off with jams and jellies and things like that. It would just be a little bit safer.
Or a basic fruit, peaches are available now.
Applesauce.
Continue.
Applesauce is a really easy one.
Yes. Tomato products are really easy. Don't forget to add the lemon juice. But other than that,
it's good to just learn the logistics, like how early you have to start. How soon should you put on your water bath and start getting that to heat? How long it's going to take to process your product to reduce it down. Jams and jellies, can take a long time to process down to a thickness before they're ready to go into the jar. So you just kind of have to learn the logistics and, experience. That is, and confidence, that's what you need. But you have the basics of the evidence-based information now, and you will know where to go for good resources.
So we have quite a few people that are thanking you guys for sharing your expertise and also wanting to know, they want to take some hands-on classes with you guys. So as soon as we get back to some level of normality, we'll let everybody know when those classes will be. But Daryl and Sandra, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It's been great. Thank you for inviting us.
Oh, you're very welcome. And we'll hopefully see everybody next week. And next week we are going to be talking about Earthwise pest and disease control. Myself, my buddy Ray Samuelis, and many of my colleagues are going to be on next week, giving you some great tips on how to handle disease and insect problems and use biological control around the garden and landscape. So we hope to see you right back here next week at 6:30. So take care, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Take care.